Chapter 1. The House. That time forgot the wind that swept across the Devonshire moors, carried with it a mournful kind of silence, the kind that made even birds fall quiet, as though they too respected the grief that clung to the old house on the hill. Ashbourne Manor had once been the jewel of the county, its limestone facade catching the sun like pale gold, its gardens blooming wild and fragrant with roses and lavender. Now it stood veiled in ivy and shadow, its windows shuttered, its heart sealed off by the will of its mistress. Lady Eleanor Harcourt had not left the grounds in 10 years. Every morning she woke before dawn to the same ritual: the black dress, high-necked and modest, the widow's cap, pinned with precision, the same seat by the window, overlooking the orchard where her husband once walked before the war took him away. Her tea went cold before she touched it, and the letters on her writing desk, letters she could never send, gathered dust beneath her trembling hand. It was said she had been beautiful once, the kind of beauty that softened even the hardest of men. But 10 years of mourning had a way of carving sorrow into the flesh, hollowing her cheeks, paling her skin, and dimming the amber light in her eyes. Still, there was a grace about her, something dignified in the way she carried her sadness. Even the servants whispered in awe of it. "Her ladyship doesn't age," said the housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, polishing the silver in the quiet drawing-room. "It's as if time itself daren't touch her." To which the young maid, Anna, replied softly, "Maybe it's because time's stopped in this house, ma'am. I don't think it's moved since the captain died." They were not wrong. The house lived in a perpetual winter. No music, no laughter, no gatherings, only the echo of what once had been. The grand piano in the music room remained closed. The ballroom, once host to candlelit waltzes and whispered flirtations, was now a storage space for covered furniture. Even the clocks had stopped, as if in reverence. Only one room showed signs of life: the library. It was here that Eleanor spent her days. Rows of books surrounded her like quiet companions. Their pages faded, their spines cracked. She read by the fire that no longer warmed her, and sometimes, when the world outside howled too loudly, she would press her hand to her heart and whisper her husband's name, as though it could still bring him back. That morning, a soft knock sounded at the door. "Enter," she said, her voice calm, measured, a voice that had not trembled in years. Mrs. Briggs appeared, her hands folded neatly before her apron. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but there's a gentleman below asking for an audience. Says he was sent by Lord Windermere." Eleanor did not look up from her book. "Lord Windermere has sent too many men in the past year. Tell this one I have no need for company." Mrs. Briggs hesitated. "He's not calling socially, my lady. He's an architect." That made Eleanor look up. "An architect?" "Yes, ma'am. He says he's been commissioned to survey the manor, to prepare estimates for restoration." Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly, the faintest expression of life after years of stillness. "Restoration? By whose authority?" "By the banks, I believe," Mrs. Briggs replied nervously. "It seems they're concerned about the estate's condition. His papers are in order. A Mr. Trevelyan from London." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Eleanor closed her book, slowly, carefully. "Tell him I will grant him 10 minutes in the morning room." When she entered that room, sunlight filtering weakly through the lace curtains, she found him standing by the mantelpiece, studying a cracked portrait with a faint, amused smile. He was younger than she expected, perhaps mid-30s, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly disheveled by the wind. His coat was well worn but of good quality, his boots muddied from the long walk up the drive, and his eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, turned toward her with unflinching ease. Most men averted their gaze when faced with Lady Harcourt's black-clad presence. He did not. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly. "Nicholas Trevelyan, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "I was told you were sent by the bank," she replied, voice cool. "I assume you are here to make some unpleasant assessment." He smiled, and it was not the kind of smile one could easily dislike. It held mischief, warmth, and a certain defiance that made her uneasy. "I'm here to save your roof, my lady," he said lightly, "and perhaps your walls, if they'll let me." Her lips pressed together. "Ashbourne Manor has stood for centuries, Mr. Trevelyan. It does not need saving." "With respect," he said, turning to the window, "the eastern wing disagrees. One more winter storm, and it may decide to retire altogether." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're remarkably frank." He turned back to her. "You strike me as a woman who prefers honesty to flattery." That startled her, not the words themselves, but the way he said them, calmly, as though he saw through the silence she had built like a fortress around herself. She folded her hands. 10 minutes, Mr. Trevelyan. Please use them wisely." He inclined his head, and for the next few minutes he spoke of repairs. Stonework, roofing, the crumbling foundations of the West Hall. His words were measured, professional, but his tone was laced with something playful, as if he found amusement in her restraint. When at last he paused, Eleanor said softly, "You speak as though you enjoy decay, Mr. Trevelyan." He smiled again. "A real one this time. Decay tells a story, my lady. It reminds me that even the strongest structures once began as something fragile." Her breath caught before she could stop it. It had been years since anyone said something that reached her like that, but she recovered quickly. "You will report your findings to Lord Windermere," she said, stepping back toward the door. "I trust you'll require no further assistance from me." "On the contrary," he said, his gaze following her. "I suspect I'll need to ask you a great many questions about the house, about its history." Her hand froze on the doorknob. "Then you'll find your answers in the archives, not from me." "As you wish," he said easily. "But if I may, the house isn't the only thing that's forgotten how to live, Lady Harcourt." She turned sharply, but he was already bowing again, polite, infuriatingly composed. "I'll begin in the East Wing," he added, heading toward the hall. "You'll hear a fair bit of hammering, I'm afraid. I do apologize in advance. Silence has its uses, but so does a little noise." And then he was gone. For a long moment, Eleanor stood motionless, staring after him. The fire crackled, a bird sang outside, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt something shift, something small but unmistakably alive. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the first thread of color weaving its way into the endless black of her days. Chapter 2. The Man Who Laughed at Ghosts. The following days brought a peculiar kind of disturbance to Ashbourne Manor. Not a violent one, nothing so dramatic, but something subtler, more unsettling, a rhythm of footsteps in the hallways that had long known only silence, the occasional sound of tools clinking, the murmur of a man's voice humming softly to himself as he worked. Nicholas Trevelyan had begun his restoration of the East Wing. At first, Lady Eleanor ignored it. She told herself she could endure the intrusion, that this was simply business, a necessity imposed upon her by the estate's trustees. But as the days turned to a week, she found herself listening for his voice against her will. He sang sometimes, not loudly, not even well, but with an ease that filled the house with something dangerously close to life. It irritated her, and yet she caught herself pausing at the landing to hear it. One morning she descended the grand staircase only to find him in the main hall, sleeves rolled up, examining a cracked section of plaster. His coat lay discarded over a chair, revealing forearms dusted with white chalk, strong and sure in their movements. Eleanor hesitated at the last step. "Mr. Trevelyan," he turned, and that irreverent smile returned. "Good morning, my lady. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten this part of the house existed." Her tone remained even. "I prefer quiet spaces." He glanced around, eyes twinkling. "Then I must be your greatest trial." "You are a necessary one," she replied, though her lips nearly curved. "Almost. How goes the work?" "Slowly," he admitted, brushing dust from his hands. "Your manner is stubborn. Every time I patch one crack, another reveals itself. Rather like the people who live in it, I'd wager." Eleanor's brow lifted slightly. "You presume much?" "Only what's plain to see," he said with a shrug. "This house was built to endure, not to be entombed. It wants to breathe again." She studied him for a moment. His confidence bordered on insolence, yet there was no malice in it. It was as though he was speaking not only of the house, but of her. "I don't believe walls have desires, Mr. Trevelyan," she said softly. "Then you've never really listened to them." There was a beat of silence. She turned away, unwilling to admit that his words had unsettled her. "If you require tea or refreshments, Mrs. Briggs will see to it. I prefer that you confine your work to daylight hours, as you wish." But as she started to leave, his voice stopped her. "Forgive me, my lady. May I ask you something?" She paused, her back still to him. "If you must. Why do you keep all the curtains drawn, even in the rooms that face the gardens?" Her shoulders stiffened. "Because I prefer not to live in glare." He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. "And yet you have the most beautiful garden I've seen in Devonshire. Seems a shame to hide it." That evening, she stood by her window long after sunset, staring toward the east wing where a faint light flickered behind scaffolding. She told herself she resented his boldness, but beneath the irritation a different feeling grew, one she couldn't name. It was that same night that Mrs. Briggs brought word of him again. "Beg pardon, my lady," she said, entering the library. "Mr. Trevelyan's asking after the old blueprints. Says he needs them to study the foundation." Eleanor looked up from her book. "They should be in the document chest near the study." "He's looked there, ma'am. Says they might be in your late husband's records." Her breath caught. "In Captain Harcourt's papers?" "Yes, ma'am." The name, her husband's name, still had power. 10 years, and it could still strike like the toll of a bell. She rose, her hands trembling slightly. "Very well. Tell him I shall bring them myself." The study had not been entered in months. It smelled faintly of ink and cedar, with dust glimmering in the beam of her candlelight. Her husband's desk remained as he'd left it, maps rolled in their cases, a quill still resting where his hand had once held it. She searched in silence until a voice behind her made her start. "You should let me help you." She turned sharply. Nicholas stood in the doorway, hat in hand. His tone was gentle now, the teasing gone. "I told Mrs. Briggs I would fetch them," she said quietly. "You had no need to follow." "Forgive me," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude. Only it didn't seem right, you coming here alone." "I am not fragile, Mr. Trevelyan." "I never said you were." Their eyes met, hers dark with restraint, his unflinchingly steady. Something in his expression softened then, and he stepped closer. "You loved him very much." She froze. "That is not your concern." "No," he agreed softly, "but I think it's your burden." Her composure faltered. "You speak of things you cannot understand." "Perhaps," he said, studying her face, "but I've seen what grief can do. It builds walls higher than any I could ever repair." The air between them shifted, heavy with something that was not yet affection, but far more dangerous. "I do not wish to discuss my private life with you," she said finally, turning away. He inclined his head. "Then I'll say no more." He crossed to the desk and began to help her search. After a moment, he found a folder bound in ribbon and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, a brief, electric contact that startled them both. Eleanor drew her hand back as if burned. "Thank you," she murmured. "Of course," he said, "and for what it's worth, my lady, I don't believe the dead would want us to spend our lives pretending we're buried with them." Before she could answer, he bowed and left her in the flickering candlelight. She stood alone in that room for a long time, the scent of cedar and dust surrounding her. His words echoed, unwanted and yet impossible to silence. When she returned to her chambers, she passed a mirror and caught her own reflection. The woman staring back looked pale and haunted, but for the first time in years, there was a flicker of color in her cheeks. She did not recognize herself, and that frightened her most of all. The next morning, the sound of hammering resumed. It was louder than before, rhythmic, determined, alive, and though she told herself it was nothing more than noise, she could not deny the truth. Ashbourne Manor was beginning to breathe again. Chapter 3. The Portrait Room. Days passed, and winter sunlight began to stretch timidly across the frost-glazed lawns of Ashbourne. The house that had once seemed entombed in shadow now bore faint signs of life. A door left ajar, a curtain drawn open, the faint echo of footsteps travelling beyond their usual boundaries. To the servants, it was a curious miracle. Mrs. Briggs whispered to the maids that Lady Harcourt had been seen walking the gallery, a place she hadn't stepped foot in since her husband's passing. "Imagine that," the cook said, nearly dropping her ladle. 10 years without a single stroll beyond the library, and now she's wandering again. Anna, the youngest maid, smiled shyly. "It's that Mr. Trevelyan, I'll wager. He's got a way of bringing a bit of warmth, even in all that dust and gloom." Mrs. Briggs gave a disapproving sniff, but didn't entirely disagree. Indeed it was Nicholas Trevelyan's presence that drew Eleanor from her stillness more than she cared to admit. His laughter echoed down corridors long used to whispers. His tools and sketches cluttered the halls she had kept immaculate, and though she told herself she resented it, The disruption, the untidiness, part of her had begun to listen for him each morning as though his voice had become another sound of the house itself. It was late afternoon when she found him in the west corridor, standing before a draped canvas. Dust floated in the golden light from a cracked window, and his hand rested on the edge of the cloth, as though hesitating to reveal what lay beneath. "What have you found?" she asked quietly. He turned, surprised but smiling. "Your house keeps its secrets well, my lady. I was exploring this hall when I stumbled upon a locked door. Anna mentioned it hadn't been opened in years. That room," she said, her voice lowering, "belonged to my husband." He studied her expression. "Then perhaps it's time it belonged to you again." She stiffened. "It does not concern you, Mr. Trevelyan." He inclined his head. "Forgive me. I only thought sometimes the past must be faced before it releases us." She said nothing, her hands tightening around the black folds of her gown. He turned back to the canvas, curiosity tempered with care. "May I?" Eleanor hesitated, the keys at her waist, heavy with the weight of a decade. At last, she nodded. "Very well." He drew the cloth away. Beneath it hung a portrait, large, imposing, and unmistakably intimate. It was her, Lady Eleanor Harcourt, painted in her 24th year. The artist had captured her as she once was, radiant, laughing, her chestnut hair tumbling loose over a gown of emerald silk. Behind her stood her husband, Captain Thomas Harcourt, his hand resting on her shoulder, his gaze proud, possessive. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. The color, the joy, the life in that canvas. It was all gone from her now. She felt as though she were standing before a ghost. Nicholas said nothing. He simply watched her. The flicker of empathy in his blue eyes, deep and quiet. She moved closer, her voice almost a whisper. "This was painted the year before the war. I remember hating it. I thought it made me look too young, too foolishly happy. Perhaps it showed you as you truly were," he said softly. "Then I envy that woman," she murmured. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the frame, brushing away the thin veil of dust. And as she did, something caught her eye, a small gap in the gilded edge. Curious, Nicholas leaned closer. "Wait," he said, gently prying at the corner. "There's something wedged behind the frame." Together they loosened the canvas from the wall. Behind it, tucked neatly in the hollow between plaster and wood, was a thin bundle of yellowed papers bound by ribbon. Eleanor's breath quickened. "Letters." Nicholas handed them to her with care. "They're addressed to you." Her name, Lady Eleanor Harcourt, was scrawled in a hand she recognized instantly. Thomas's handwriting. Her knees nearly gave way, and Nicholas caught her elbow instinctively. "Easy," he said gently. She looked at the letters, unable to open them. Her husband had been declared missing at sea 10 years ago. No body, no closure, only the black-edged telegram that had condemned her to mourning. I thought everything of his was already returned," she whispered. "Then these were hidden," Nicholas said. "For a reason." They carried the bundle to the library. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and smoke. As she sat before the fire, her trembling fingers tracing the ribbon, Nicholas stood nearby, silent, watching her with an expression caught between curiosity and concern. again. At last, she untied it. The first letter was dated 2 months before the shipwreck. My dearest Eleanor, I write this from Lisbon, where our orders have changed. There are rumors, whispers that the mission we were sent upon is not what it seems. If anything should happen to me, know that my choices were not all my own. Trust only those who come in Windmere's name. He alone will understand. Her eyes blurred. Windmere, she murmured. My cousin. He was his closest friend. Nicholas frowned slightly. Do you know what he meant by that? Not all my own choices? No, she said softly, folding the page. He was always secretive about his affairs abroad. I thought it was merely military discretion. She hesitated before opening the next letter. This one was darker, its ink smudged, hurried. Eleanor, forgive me. I have learned something I cannot undo. If the worst befalls me, promise me you will not trust the Admiralty. The truth will be buried with me. Burn this if it reaches you. Her hands shook. Nicholas knelt beside her. My lady, are you certain you wish to read more tonight? She looked up at him then, really looked, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a contractor or an intruder, but a man who was not afraid of her sorrow, a man who looked at her as if she were still capable of feeling. I've lived with silence long enough, she said quietly. If the truth has been hiding here all this time, I want to know it. He nodded. Then we'll find it together. The firelight flickered between them, warm against the gathering dusk. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and in that unguarded space, something wordless passed between them. It wasn't yet love. It wasn't even desire. It was recognition, the quiet, dangerous understanding between two people who had both known loss and who now found themselves standing at the threshold of change. When at last she dismissed him for the night, he paused at the door. Lady Harcourt, he said softly, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you are not the ghost your house believes you to be. She turned her face toward the fire, unable to meet his gaze. And what am I then, Mr. Trevelyan? He smiled faintly. A woman still waiting to wake up. And before she could reply, he was gone, leaving her alone with the letters, the portrait, and the unbearable sound of her own heartbeat. That night, long after the candles had burned low, Lady Eleanor Harcourt read every word her husband had never meant her to find, and somewhere deep within the silent bones of Ashbourne Manor, something shifted again. Not just the sound of the wind, but the quiet beginning of resurrection. Chapter 4. The Whisper of Scandal. By early spring, Ashbourne Manor had changed. The ivy had been trimmed back, revealing pale stone beneath. The broken shutters had been mended, and where silence once hung like fog, there was now the sound of movement, of voices, of hammers echoing through the halls. But the most remarkable transformation was not in the manor itself, it was in its mistress. Lady Eleanor Harcourt, once the ghostly figure of Devonshire gossip, had been seen walking the grounds again. Once, twice, even 3 times a week. She no longer kept to her morning rooms. She spoke to the servants without that distant glaze in her eyes. Once, Anna caught sight of her standing beneath the blooming wisteria, her black skirts touched with sunlight, and she was smiling. Of course, such things did not go unnoticed. By the time word reached the neighboring estates, the story had taken taken on its own life, that the widow had found companionship with her architect, that she entertained him privately in the library, that laughter had been heard at Ashbourne for the first time in a decade. To some it was merely curiosity, to others it was scandal, and in Devonshire society, scandal travelled faster than spring rain. It was on a grey Tuesday when the first consequence arrived, in the form of a letter sealed with Lord Windermere's crest. Eleanor received it at breakfast, the paper thick and expensive, the handwriting sharp as ever. She broke the seal with a frown. "My dearest cousin, it has come to my attention through sources most regrettable that you have allowed a certain gentleman, one Mr. Trevelyan, to remain at Ashbourne in a capacity that extends beyond his professional obligations. I trust these reports are exaggerated. You know how the county delights in mischief. Still, I must urge caution. A lady of your station cannot afford the smallest hint of impropriety, particularly while your husband's memory remains so publicly revered. If this arrangement continues, I fear the trustees may reconsider their support of the estate's restoration. I shall call upon you within the fortnight. Yours, in familial concern, Windermere." Eleanor folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling not with fear but anger. How easy it was for men like her cousin to speak of propriety. Men who had never spent a decade entombed in loneliness. When Nicholas entered the drawing-room an hour later, dust in his hair and a grin on his lips, he noticed at once that her expression had hardened. "My lady," he said lightly, "if I didn't know better, I'd say the weather has turned indoors." "You may as well have brought the storm yourself," she said coldly, tossing the letter onto the table. "It seems your presence here has given my cousin reason to question my virtue." He blinked. "Your virtue? Do not mock me." He held up his hands. "I wouldn't dare, but surely you don't give weight to the gossip of people who've never met me." "Unfortunately, those people control my estate," she said sharply. "If they withdraw their support, Ashbourne will fall into ruin, and I with it." For a moment silence stretched between them. Nicholas's tone softened. "Then tell me what you wish me to do." "Leave," she said quietly. The word came out before she'd meant to say it, and yet the moment it left her lips, she felt it like a blade in her chest. Nicholas looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression, only something far more painful. "Is that truly what you want?" Her eyes flicked to the letter. "What I want is irrelevant. I must protect what remains of my family's name." He nodded once. "I see." He turned to leave, and her breath caught. "Mr. Trevelyan." He stopped in the doorway. "I didn't mean," she faltered, her composure cracking. "You have done nothing wrong, only I cannot endure another loss. Not now." He looked back at her then, and the sorrow in his eyes mirrored her own. "Eleanor," he said quietly. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name aloud. "Not every loss is the end of something. Sometimes it's the beginning." Her throat tightened. "Please," she whispered, "don't make this harder." He bowed his head. "Very well." And with that, he was gone. For 3 days, the manor was silent again. The east wing stood empty, the tools packed away, the air heavy with absence. Eleanor moved through the halls, as though walking through the aftermath of a dream. She returned to her black gowns, her closed doors, her tea that went cold before she touched it. The servants avoided her eyes. Even the wind seemed to mourn. On the fourth morning, Mrs. Briggs found her in the library, staring at the fire. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the housekeeper said gently, "but there's a gentleman asking for you at the gate." Eleanor didn't look up. "Tell him I'm not receiving. He's rather insistent." "I said, it's Mr. Trevelyan, ma'am." Her heart stilled. "Send him away," she said weakly. "He should not be here." Mrs. Briggs hesitated, then cleared her throat. "He said you'd say that, my lady. And he also said that if you wish to see what your husband truly meant by those letters, you might want to hear what he's found." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What he's found?" "Yes, ma'am, something in the foundations. A box sealed behind the east wall." She found him there an hour later, covered in dust, lantern light flickering over his face as he crouched near the exposed brickwork. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly, without looking up. "What is this about?" she demanded. He gestured the small iron box resting on the floor. "I found it behind the hearthstone. Old military issue. It bears your husband's initials." Her breath caught. How did you—" "I noticed the mortar had been redone," he said simply. "A patch job, done by hand, not professionally. Someone wanted this hidden with careful hands." He pried it open. Inside lay a stack of folded documents, brittle with age, and atop them a signet ring bearing the Harcourt crest. Eleanor stared at it. That was his. He never removed it. Nicholas passed it to her. "There's more. These letters, they're written in another hand, the same as the ones you found behind the portrait." She unfolded one, her eyes scanning quickly. Then she froze. "Payment received. Ship redirected under new orders. Captain Harcourt will not suspect until it's too late." Her hand trembled. "These are orders of sabotage. Someone arranged." Nicholas's voice was grim. "It seems your husband's death wasn't an accident." For a moment she could not breathe. The room spun, the lantern light blurring around her. Nicholas reached for her, steadying her as she sank onto the cold stone floor. "Eleanor, I thought I was mourning a man lost to the sea," she whispered. "But he was lost to betrayal." He said nothing, only knelt beside her, his hand resting gently over hers. And then, to her own astonishment, she began to cry. Not the quiet tears of long repression, but a storm of 10 years breaking loose all at once. Nicholas said nothing. He didn't shush her or offer hollow comfort. He only stayed beside her, his warmth grounding her against the cold. When at last her sobs quieted, she turned to him with tear-streaked cheeks. "What am I to do now?" He met her gaze steadily. "You live." She gave a hollow laugh through her tears. "I don't know how." "Then let me show you," he said softly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without thinking, Eleanor reached up and brushed a streak of dust from his face. His breath caught at her touch, and for the briefest instant, time seemed to stop. Then she drew her hand back, heart racing. "I can't," she whispered. He smiled faintly, sad but understanding. "Not yet." He rose, extending a hand to help her up. "Come, there's more to uncover. The truth doesn't end here." And though she hesitated, she took his hand. Outside, the spring rain began to fall softly against the windows, washing the dust from the stone. Inside, the widow who had worn black for 10 years stood in the ruins of her silence. And for the first time in a decade, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of another's hand in hers. Chapter 5. The letter never sent. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It fell in soft, relentless curtains, draping Ashbourne in a grey veil. The manor creaked and sighed beneath it, as though weary from what it had witnessed. Eleanor Harcourt could not sleep. The box Nicholas had unearthed sat on the table before her, its iron edges rusted, its contents sprawled across parchment and tears. She had read every word of every letter, and yet she still could not comprehend the magnitude of what they revealed. Her husband, Captain Thomas Harcourt, had not drowned by misfortune. He had been silenced. The letters spoke of debts and secrets, of a deal gone wrong between the captain and a merchant consortium supplying ships for the crown. There were names, Winmere's among them, and coded references to cargo that was never recorded in the ledgers. Smuggling, sabotage, betrayal, and someone had paid for his silence. Nicholas found her still awake the next morning, pale in the dim light, her eyes red but clear. "You've been up all night," he said softly, setting a tray of tea beside her. "If I'd known you planned to interrogate ghosts, I'd have brought stronger drink." She gave him a tired smile. "I've learned more from ghosts than the living, I think." He poured her a cup, then nodded toward the letters. "Do you believe them?" "I have no choice," she said, her voice low. "It explains everything. Why the Admiralty closed the inquiry so quickly, why Windermere insisted I remain in mourning, and why the estate's accounts were frozen for years." Nicholas leaned forward, his expression grave. "If what's written here is true, then your husband's death was ordered, and the man who arranged it still profits from it." Eleanor's eyes flickered. "Windermere, perhaps," he said carefully, "but we'll need proof. More than faded ink." She rose, crossing to the window, staring out at the mist. "And if we find it, then we decide what to do with it," he said. "Expose him. Clear your husband's name. Take back what was stolen from you." She turned to face him. "We?" He smiled faintly. "You don't think I'd let you face this alone, do you?" Something unspoken passed between them then. A trust forged not by circumstance, but by choice. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like a widow bound to the past. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something new, terrifying, and alive. Over the next week, Nicholas and Eleanor scoured the manor archives. Old ledgers, correspondence, and financial statements. The firelight burned late into the night as they pieced together a picture of corruption that stretched far beyond Ashbourne. Windermere had been executor of the Harcourt estate since Thomas's death. He had claimed it was to protect Eleanor's interests. In truth, he had redirected funds to his own holdings, using Ashbourne's debts as cover. "Look at this," Nicholas said one night, spreading a stack of receipts across the table. "He's been drawing a stipend from the estate for 10 years, under your husband's seal." Her breath caught. "Forged?" He nodded grimly. "Perfectly." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the paper. "He made me believe I owed him gratitude. He took everything." Nicholas's voice softened. "Not everything." Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened, not with sorrow, but with something warmer, more dangerous. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Eleanor looked away. "If we accuse him without proof, he'll destroy us." Nicholas nodded slowly. "Then we'll find proof he can't erase." A week later, opportunity arrived, uninvited. Lord Windermere's carriage rolled into the courtyard, its wheels slicing through mud, its black horses steaming in the cold morning air. He entered without waiting to be announced, his gloved hand tapping impatiently against his cane. "Dearest cousin," he said with oily civility, "I see the rumors of your recovery were not exaggerated." Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, regal in a gown of dark green velvet, the first color she'd worn in 10 years. The sight of her, poised and luminous, seemed to unsettle him. "I trust your journey was pleasant," she said evenly. He smiled tightly. "Pleasant enough, though I confess I expected a quieter welcome. I nearly tripped over a workman in the corridor." "Mr. Trevelyan is my architect," she said. "You'll find Ashbourne much improved since your last visit." "Indeed," he drawled. "Your architect seems to have quite the influence over you." Her gaze sharpened. "And you seem overly concerned with my household affairs." "Family must look after its own," he said smoothly, removing his gloves. "Speaking of which, I'm here to review the estate accounts." "Merely a formality." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Nicholas, who stood discreetly near the hearth. "Of course," she said coolly. "I'll have them brought to the library." For 2 hours, Windermere pored over the ledgers, while Nicholas observed silently from across the room. Eleanor watched every flicker of his expression, the twitch of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes when he found an entry that didn't align with his lies. At last, Windermere closed the book. "These accounts are irregular," he said. "I imagine they would be," Eleanor replied. 10 years of forgery leaves quite a mark." The color drained from his face. "I beg your pardon?" She rose slowly. "You forged my husband's signature, diverted his estate funds, and arranged for his ship to be sabotaged. And now I have every letter and ledger to prove it." Windermere's smile faltered. "You have nothing admissible. Those letters, if they even exist, would damn your husband as well. You'd risk his reputation for your revenge." Eleanor's voice was steady. "It's not revenge I seek, it's truth." He stood abruptly, fury darkening his face. "You forget yourself, Eleanor. You forget who holds power here." "Perhaps once," she said quietly, "but not anymore." At that, Nicholas stepped forward. "I suggest you leave, my lord, before we forget our manners." Windermere's gaze flicked between them, suspicion and humiliation warring in his expression. "So it's true, then," he sneered. "The widow and her servant. What a tragic end to the Harcourt name." Nicholas's fists clenched, but Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. "Let him go," she murmured. Windermere turned toward the door, but paused. "You've made a grave mistake, cousin. The courts will never hear your case, and society will never forgive your indiscretions." She met his gaze coldly. "Then let society burn." That night the storm returned, fierce and unrelenting. Eleanor sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "He'll strike back," she said softly. "He won't let this go." Nicholas poured 2 glasses of brandy. "Then we'll be ready." She took hers, her fingers brushing his. For a moment she simply looked at him, the man who had walked into her silence and refused to let it consume her. "When I met you," she whispered, "I thought you were only here to rebuild the manor." He smiled faintly. "I was. I didn't expect to rebuild you." Her breath hitched. "And yet you did." The firelight flickered between them, gold and shadow, distance and desire. Then, as though drawn by something inevitable, Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. "Tell me this isn't madness," she murmured. "It is," he said quietly, "but it's the kind worth living for." And when he kissed her, it was not a desperate act, but a release of grief of guilt, of years spent behind walls too high to climb. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and risk and rebirth. For the first time in 10 years, Lady Eleanor Harcourt no longer felt like a widow. She felt alive. Chapter 6. The Ball at Ashbourne. For the first time in 10 years, the great ballroom of Ashbourne was alive. The chandeliers, long darkened by dust and grief, burned with golden light once more. The scent of roses drifted through the open windows, carried in by the summer breeze. Musicians tuned their violins, and laughter, bright, cautious, disbelieving laughter, filled the air. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, breath caught in her throat. She had almost forgotten what this room looked like, filled with people. For a decade it had stood as a mausoleum, draped in linen, heavy with silence. Now it pulsed with color and warmth, the past giving way to the present. Her gown, deep rose silk, the color of dawn, shimmered softly with each movement. She had not worn color since her husband's funeral. Tonight, when Anna had fastened the final button at her back, Eleanor had looked into the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman gazing back. No longer the widow who mourned the dead, but the woman who had chosen to live. The guests began to turn toward her as she descended the stairs, their whispers a wave of curiosity and awe. "Is that Lady Harcourt? She's wearing color and smiling." Eleanor held her head high. Let them talk, let them speculate. She had spent too long hiding from the world's gaze. If tonight they wished to see her, then they would see her reborn. At the base of the stairs, Nicholas was waiting. He wore formal black, a crisp white cravat, and the faintest look of disbelief as she approached him, as though seeing her for the first time. "Good evening, Mr. Trevelyan," she said softly. "Good evening, my lady," he replied, bowing. Then, more quietly, "You look like the first sunrise after a long storm." She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. "And you look entirely too comfortable in polite company. Have you been practicing?" "Only in case of emergencies," he said, eyes glinting with mischief. "And I dare say this qualifies." She laughed, a soft musical sound that made heads turn nearby. It had been years since anyone had heard that sound from her lips. Nicholas's expression softened at the sound, as though he too had been waiting for it. As the evening unfolded, Eleanor moved among her guests with poise and grace. There were courtiers from London, neighboring gentry, and even those who had once whispered cruelly about her isolation. Now they bowed and flattered her, eager to align themselves with the woman resurrected from sorrow. The orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz. Couples swept across the marble floor in a swirl of silks and candlelight. Nicholas, standing by the edge of the crowd, caught her eye. "Dance with me," he murmured. Her heart stuttered. "You forget yourself, sir. I've guests watching." "Then let them watch," he said with a grin. "You've given them gossip for years. Might as well give them something worth remembering." Despite herself, she laughed again. "You're impossible. And yet you're smiling." "That did it." She set her gloved hand in his. "Just one," she whispered. The music swelled, and they moved together as though they had done so all their lives. Eleanor had danced before, of course, at countless balls in her youth, but never like this, never with such ease, such warmth, such reckless joy. Nicholas guided her effortlessly through the steps, his hand at her waist, his gaze never leaving hers. "You were made for this," he said quietly, "for Dancing for living? Her breath caught, but she couldn't answer. The moment was too fragile, too full. Around them the world seemed to fade. There was only the music, the flicker of candles, the feel of his hand steady against her back. Then the music ended. Applause filled the air, but Eleanor barely heard it. She had not realized she was trembling until Nicholas's fingers brushed hers. "You're shaking," he said softly. "Only a little," she whispered. "I'd forgotten how it feels to be seen." He smiled faintly. "Then let them see you. You deserve it." Later, when the dancing paused for supper, Eleanor slipped out onto the balcony for air. The night was warm and scented with lilac. Below, the lawns shimmered with lantern light. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze cool her flushed cheeks, and then she heard him behind her. "I was beginning to think you'd vanished," Nicholas said, stepping into the moonlight. "I needed a moment," she replied. "It's strange. I feel both lighter and heavier at once." "That's how freedom feels," he said gently. "It doesn't come without weight." She turned to him, her smile fading as she noticed the unreadable look in his eyes. "You're quiet tonight." He hesitated. "There's something I need to tell you." Something in his tone chilled her. "What is it?" He took a breath. "I received a letter this morning from London, an offer, a commission to restore the new wing of Westminster Hall. It's the opportunity of a lifetime." Her heart sank. "That's wonderful news," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You should be proud." "I should," he said quietly, "but I'm not sure I want it." She frowned. "Nicholas," he stepped closer, "if I accept, I'll have to leave Devonshire within the month. The project could take years. I'd be half a world away." The silence between them thickened like fog. "And if you stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I stay for the wrong reasons," he said softly. "For you, and I don't want to become another man who keeps you from living freely." Her throat tightened. "You think I've not already made my choice?" He shook his head, his voice low and raw. "You've only just begun to find yourself again, Eleanor. I won't be the one to take that from you." Tears burned in her eyes. "You won't be taking anything. You'll be leaving it." For a moment, neither spoke. The night pressed around them, the music inside a distant echo. Finally, he reached for her hand. "Tell me not to go," he whispered, "and I'll stay." Her lips parted, then closed, because she could not, because she loved him too much to ask him to give up his future. Instead, she smiled through the ache. "Then go," she said softly. "Build something beautiful, and remember me when the walls begin to rise." He looked at her, long, hard, memorizing every line of her face. Then he did something she did not expect. He laughed, low, warm, utterly alive. "What's funny?" she asked, tears trembling in her lashes. "I was thinking," he said, voice thick with emotion, "how strange it is that it took 10 years and one stubborn woman in black to teach me what home means." Before she could speak, he kissed her. Tenderly, deeply, as though sealing every word they hadn't said. When they parted, her tears had fallen freely, but she was smiling. "You made me laugh again," she whispered, "and you made me live again. That's more than anyone could have done." The orchestra struck up a new waltz inside. Nicholas took a step back, still holding her gaze. "Then let's give them one more dance." And under the midsummer moon, before the crowd that once pitied her, Lady Eleanor Harcourt and Nicholas Trevelyan waltzed one final time, laughing like two people who had finally remembered how. Chapter 7. The Dawn Beyond Morning. The first light of dawn crept over the hills, gilding the ivy on Ashbourne's walls. Mist clung to the grass like breath, and the gardens shimmered with dew. For the first time in years, the manor no longer looked haunted, it looked awake. Eleanor Harcourt stood at her window, the pale rose light touching her face. She had not worn black in a long while. It had been nearly a year since that night. The night of the midsummer ball, the night Nicholas had kissed her beneath the moon and left before sunrise. He had written from London, sometimes from the coast, once even from Edinburgh, his letters full of life, of the work he loved, of buildings rising from ruin. He never once asked her to wait, and yet she had, not in the desperate way she had once waited for a husband lost at sea, but in the quiet faith of a woman who finally understood that love was not possession but remembrance, a thread that endured without being pulled. That morning the gardens called to her. Eleanor stepped outside, her gown a soft ivory, her shawl caught by the breeze. Around her the world was blooming again, the wisteria cascading from the trellis, the roses heavy with fragrance. The gardeners had restored the old fountain, its stone newly cleaned, its water clear and bright as glass. As she reached it, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her, familiar, steady, real. "Forgive me," said a voice she had not heard in months. "I seem to have a habit of arriving unannounced." She turned, and there he was, Nicholas Trevelyan, older by a season, his hair a little longer, his face touched by sun and distance. He carried no plans, no papers, only a travel-worn satchel slung over his shoulder, and that same disarming smile. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The wind stirred between them, lifting the scent of lilac. "You're early," she said at last, her voice trembling slightly. "Your letter said you wouldn't return until—" "Michaelmas, I finish sooner than expected," he said softly. "I thought perhaps Ashbourne might have missed me." Her lips curved. "Ashbourne, perhaps. Its mistress, I cannot say." He laughed, that deep, unguarded laugh that had first drawn her back to life. "Ah, there's the sharp tongue I remember." "You encouraged it," she said. "You shouldn't be surprised when it answers back." He took a step closer. "You look well, Eleanor." "I am," she said simply. "For the first time, I truly am." They stood by the fountain, watching the ripples scatter across the surface. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold through the leaves. "I saw your name in the Times," she said after a moment. "They called Westminster Hall a masterpiece." He shrugged lightly. "It's just stone and timber." "It's more than that," she said. "You gave it new life, as you did this place." He glanced at her. "And you've turned mourning into something luminous." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps grief never ends. It only changes shape. It stops being a shadow that haunts and becomes a light that guides." He nodded slowly. "Thomas would have been proud of you." Her eyes softened. "I think perhaps he would have liked you." "I doubt it," Nicholas said with a small grin, "but I'll take your word for it." They both laughed, freely, easily. The sound mingled with the morning breeze, and for a moment it felt as though the very air rejoiced with them. Then Nicholas grew quiet. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I didn't come back only to admire the gardens." She turned toward him. "No?" He shook his head. "I came back because every place I've worked since I left, every house, every hall, every city, felt unfinished. I thought I was chasing greatness. Turns out I was only chasing peace." and I left it here." Her breath caught. "Nicholas." He reached out, not to pull her close, but simply to hold out his hand, palm open in the soft light. "I don't want to save you," he said quietly. "I never did. I only want to walk beside you wherever you choose to go." For a moment the world went still. Only the fountain murmured, the birds beginning their morning song. Eleanor looked at his hand, rough from work, steady and patient, and then up at the man who had taught her how to laugh again, how to live again, and she took it. They walked through the garden together, their steps unhurried, the sun warming the path before them. The roses brushed their sleeves, and the shadows of the past fell away behind them like old veils. When they reached the far terrace, Eleanor paused, looking back toward the manor, its windows bright with morning light, its doors open to the day. "I used to think," she said softly, "that love ended with death." "And now?" Nicholas asked. "Now I know it begins with life," she said, turning to him. "And I intend to keep living." He smiled, drawing her gently closer. "Then so will I." As the sun rose fully over Ashbourne, gilding the gardens in gold, the widow who had worn black for 10 years stood beside the man who had made her laugh again, not as a woman haunted by what she had lost, but as one who had finally learned to embrace what remained. And when their laughter drifted through the summer air, it sounded at last like home.